Hola, soy Litzy La Bomba Dilene, boxeadora profesional de México, y estás viendo el show de Todd Atkins, en donde verás y escucharás a grandes talentos del boxeo. No te lo puedes perder.
All right, so this is Todd Atkins, and I'm here with Zach Arnold from the MMA Draw Fight Opinion. He used to also have a blog called like Pro Wrestling Power, and he's been covering this UFC antitrust lawsuit. And today, the judge officially rejected the first settlement that the UFC had put forth that both parties had eventually basically agreed on. And Zach, I kind of wanted to get kind of your opening thoughts on what you think of all this.
I'm not surprised that Judge Boulware rejected the settlement. What I am surprised about is how many people seem to be pro-settlement, at least the ones who claim to be pro-fighter. And now we're going to kind of see who really wanted this case to go to trial and who was really bluffing.
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't know. I want your opinion. I think part of me feels like maybe the lawyers knew that the judge wasn't going to accept it, the fighter lawyers, that is. And maybe they were trying to show that they were being cooperative or at least trying to negotiate in somewhat good faith, knowing that the judge wasn't going to accept that settlement. What do you think?
That's the wrong read.
Really?
These attorneys got caught off guard. They got caught off guard. And I don't think anyone right now on either side of that case is very, very happy at all. What will be interesting to me is to see what the reaction from fighters is, and do we see outside counsel try to get involved and say, hey, we don't like what's going on. Can we intervene?
What do you mean by outside counsel? And why would they intervene?
There may be some fighters who are sitting here going, wait a second, I didn't know anything about this settlement. I didn't know the details. I wasn't part of the negotiations. Maybe my interests are not represented fully in this. Did I have a loud enough voice? There may be some concerns, and there may be some attorneys getting in the ears of some of these fighters on the outside saying, hey, you guys are getting either ripped off, or maybe the settlement's not good enough, or the counsel's not aggressive enough, and we have concerns. And, when you get in these situations where settlements, especially like this, of this magnitude and size, get rejected, you get to hear a lot of leaks internally of disgust and anger. It's kind of like politics. But you also get to see outsiders try to say, hey, let's get involved in this case, and let's see if Judge Boulware will give us an opening to get involved.
The reason I have my suspicions that maybe they knew is because I really didn't hear the fighters saying, hey, this settlement's no good. You know what I mean?
Well, Judge Boulware truly, I think he truly believes, at least from his perspective. Now, I don't know if he can say it out loud and directly in bold language, but I do believe that he thinks the fighters do not understand what is going on. And he's extremely concerned about it. And I think that's one of the motivating factors for why he's not approving this.
Yeah, because I think there are a lot of people on like Twitter and social media are like, this settlement sucks. They hardly paid anything, and they aren't really giving up much in the way of contractual concessions. This settlement was all on the side of the UFC. It was nothing favorable for the fighters.
Well, the biggest problem for the plaintiffs in getting the settlement across the finish line is that Judge Boulware got a free preview of what UFC's behavior would look like post-settlement. And we've seen the last few months, they've been completely outrageous. They've been very reckless. They made a lot of grandstanding moves. We've seen fighters get cut. We've seen lots of angry Dana quotes and comments. And Judge Boulware's looking at this saying, wait a second. You guys are promising me a settlement that supposedly is going to change the behavior of UFC corporate, and I see not only no behavioral change, I see a stock price that went up $30. So convince me that this settlement actually has some teeth to it, and so far you can't do it. And that's why his perspective is like, no, I'm not going to play ball here. And yes, I may be the bad guy for not allowing fighters to get some money, but I don't believe you guys have been fighting this case good enough, and I believe the evidence post-announcement of the settlement initially shows that I'm vindicated. So that's his position, and that's a position I don't think the attorneys can fight.
Yeah, because I remember Miguel kind of said he thought it was over because he thought the judge would just rubber stamp it. But he did say, based on the evidence, it would make sense for the judge to not accept it because it's pretty obvious that the UFC has been acting, in violation of antitrust laws. Their contracts are possibly illegal. And that's like everyone's known that for years and years and years. So,
well, that's one of the biggest keys and takeaways from this case that I don't think is saturated in the public's mind yet, which is Judge Boulware, without specifically declaring it, but in a roundabout way, has all but said that in his opinion, UFC is liable for antitrust violations. And he just takes it for granted. As a fact, it's not an opinion to him, it's more of a fact. Right. So from that perspective, if you believe what Judge Boulware believes, then this settlement fails the test of actually improving conditions. He doesn't think it's serious.
Right, and that's what I was saying. I think, based on looking at the evidence, the judge already knows that the UFC is guilty of violating antitrust laws, and he probably knows they're a monopoly too. And he's saying, look, this settlement is nothing. We can go to trial, and they can try to defend themselves, or we need a better settlement, one or the other.
I don't see a better settlement coming. And one of the reasons why I don't think we're going to see a better settlement coming is because is the UFC willing to double the amount in the Congolese class? Are they willing to go from 335 to, let's say, 575 or 600 million? There's nothing there that indicates Ari Emanuel or Mark Shapiro would ever do that. So it's obvious UFC would rather have increased odds of going to trial and winning and taking their chances versus actually paying out more money. And we have a conference call here for TKO next Friday, August the 8th, early in the morning. So what are they going to tell investors? I think their perspective is, look, this judge is out of control and he's incorrigible and we're not going to get a settlement through. And so we're going to prevail at trial and we're going to win. And they may have a very good argument for that because they have to have only one juror in a federal antitrust case that says, I don't believe they're guilty or I don't believe they're liable. So that can derail the entire case. But on the other hand, it is a risk. You cannot deny that there is now a substantial exposure for TKO to lose its antitrust case, and that would be financially catastrophic because then they'd have to put up the money to actually secure any appellate rights, and that could cost them billions of dollars.
Yeah, and also, all the negative publicity that would come out if this case went to trial, given all the stuff that would kind of have a microscope on it.
But that's the thing about Endeavor and how powerful Ari Emanuel is, because he's the agent or representative for not only so many television networks, but so many media personalities. They have been wildly successful in smothering, at least in my opinion, smothering this story and the negative impacts and possible angles. Because if this was any other major antitrust case in sports, especially if you compare it to the coverage at Ed O'Bannon at the NCAA, or recently the NFL Sunday Ticket case, the coverage of the UFC antitrust case has been sparse, minimal. Very few people have actually showed up to these court hearings. There's no local press. The Vegas press has not sent any cameras. They've not sent any reporters to these court hearings. They've not covered it at all. And so if you look at it from that perspective, Endeavor's power as an agent and a media representative has really greatly helped them limit their exposure as far as what the public knows or doesn't know about the story.
That's a good point. Do you think if they went to trial, that would change it all?
I am very skeptical that many people would show up to cover this trial.
But I mean, in terms of the MMA media, like how much do you really think they would have much outreach if a significant amount of them showed up to cover it?
I don't think a significant amount of people are going to show up to cover it.
Right. But people that are locally based in Vegas, well, I mean, Josh Gross has been there.
I disagree with that. I don't think people in Vegas are going to show up at all. I think we're going to see a self-imposed blackout, almost a self-censorship and we're just going to say, well, there's not enough interest in the story.
You don't think Josh Gross and some of these guys that are already covering it wouldn't show up?
Well, I could see Josh appearing a day or two, but Josh is not going to be able to stay for 2 weeks or 4 weeks or 6 weeks in any sort of residence in Vegas. So you have to depend on the locals, and the locals are not going to do it. Many of the locals, whether they're Twitter personalities or if they're TV networks, they've got their own agenda. So they're not going to spend 6 weeks covering this case. Their mind's elsewhere. They're not going to spend the time and resources to document what's going to happen. I think in many ways, this case, if it does happen and goes to trial, it's almost going to be almost a trial in absentia in terms of the amount of information flow that gets to the public.
Yeah. So in your eyes, it seems like you're thinking that the fighter side of it would not come out victorious if they took this to trial. Am I reading you right?
I'm not certain or confident in either way. And I don't think TKO should be that way either. But right now, I think they very much feel that they have it in the bag. But they also thought they had a settlement in the bag, and they were wrong.
Right. And they did put in their statement that they were open to looking at another settlement. Do you believe that, or do you think that was just kind of talk in the statement?
I think it's empty talk.
Yeah, it's been, to me, like what Miguel had said last time, is he feels like they're guilty, and he's had his own experiences with the UFC when he was a Bodog, and he feels pretty confident that they are in violation of some of these things, and if they went to trial, it would be pretty obvious. But you don't think so?
It's not that I don't think so, but it's just Vegas is a company town, and you have so many people who have self-interest in the UFC, and they emotionally connect themselves to UFC, whether or not they have a relationship or not. So when you have that kind of powerful connection, you can sometimes convince yourself of something that normally would be against your interests.
Why do you think more fighters haven't come out and commented on this settlement?
Fear factor, because if you want to be an MMA fighter, it's UFC or nothing. And so it's very much like politics. Are you scared to death to come out against someone who you believe could change your life and destroy your life?
No, I'm talking about the ones who have already fought, they're already done with their careers, but they were part of this.
I think many of them don't understand at all, and they're not engaged enough in the process, and they haven't been. And I think that's the question you just asked there, Todd, is exactly the question that Judge Boulware's been asking. And I think he came to the conclusion early on in his heart that the fighters don't know what's going on, and they haven't been represented fully by either side. And he believes that if they knew what was going on, they would not approve of this. So that has always been the overarching question in Judge Boulware's mind as to why fighters have been so silent about this situation, because he doesn't think their interests are being represented.
The reason I wonder is, John Fitch, he's a bright guy, Carlos Newton, guys, a lot of the guys who are involved in this at the top, maybe they don't want to talk about it because they're, with the lawyers or whatever. But you really haven't heard a peep out of those guys, which is kind of, I thought if John Fitch didn't like the settlement, for example, he's pretty aggressive, in terms of letting his opinions out. And he really hasn't said much about it. And I do think he understands what's going on.
I'm not entirely certain of that. And I'm not saying they're stupid. I'm saying that on the food chain of information flow, you and I seem to be as plugged in, if not more plugged in, than the fighters. And that's partially because we're so engaged in this and we have so much experience covering this business. We kind of have a sense of what is going on. But I think Judge Boulware suspects, and again, I don't know if it's fair or unfair, and I don't know if I would agree with his concerns or his criticisms, but I think he truly believes these fighters have not been steadily fed information regarding what is happening day to day. And as long as that process is not part of their daily lives, they may be underestimating how much money they would get in a settlement or how much money they could get out of a trial. And so I don't think Judge Boulware believes that these fighters have enough economic or business or legal literacy about this case.
Right. And I also think he looked at it and he's like, yeah, well, they're giving a measly sum in the big scheme of things, and they still want to operate as they've always operated, which is why we're here in the first place.
That has been the most powerful part of this whole proposed antitrust settlement, Todd. Judge Boulware got a free preview of what the environment would look like post-settlement. He saw zero change. He saw zero remorse out of the UFC. They have not changed their behavior. In fact, they've gotten much worse. They're much more arrogant, much more sloppy, much more in your face, and much more of a government contractor. So he's looking at this saying, wait a second. Not one damn thing has changed since the settlement was announced. Why should I approve it? Because if I believe you're liable for antitrust violations, this settlement hasn't changed your behavior 1 ounce. It's not going to reward the fighters enough, past and present. So why should I go along with this? You've demonstrated nothing. You haven't even demonstrated a probability of any sort of change because there hasn't been any change at all.
Yeah, why do you think they've been so sloppy in that regard? I mean, I know when the Zuffa first acquired the UFC, they were sloppy in a lot of things, which maybe could come back to bite them in this lawsuit because they weren't as buttoned up back then. But now it seems like they're just as sloppy. Why do you think they're doing that?
It's my opinion that Bill Isaacson, the attorney from Paul Weiss, has been very confident, if not overconfident, that he had a settlement in the bag. And whatever he told, Team UFC, whatever Ike Epstein told Team UFC, they took it as a guarantee and a lock that the settlement would happen, and this was all over. And once the combined settlement was done, they were free and clear. They would never have to face another lawsuit the rest of their lives. And so they behaved accordingly. That perspective in my mind, especially when you look at Bill Isaacson going on his website, in his bio page, bragging about getting this settlement, securing this settlement, and using it almost as part of his CV. I mean, Judge Boulware's looking at that going, this is so highly offensive. You guys had no intention of actually changing or showing any remorse or any contractual changes at all. I don't believe anything you're telling me. Why should I approve this?
Yeah, and, I know he's going to have a statement come out, pretty soon. What do you think it's going to look like?
I'd say at best a few pages, and it will just reiterate some of the things I've written about at the MMA Draw about his concerns on the case. He doesn't believe the settlement's worth enough. He doesn't believe there's any contractual changes. He does not believe that UFC has any remorse. They've shown none. Their legal counsel does not always show up for every court hearing. So he doesn't think they take him seriously. Well, now they're going to take him seriously. Or if they don't, they may lose at trial, and then they can really take him seriously then.
Yeah, it's a crazy thing. For me, like we had just talked about, how they're still behaving in the same manner, and like you said, maybe they thought this was locked up. I don't know. I would just think guys like Ari Emanuel or people who, have been at this for a long time would be smarter than to let them behave in that manner. But, in a lot of ways, Dana White is his own worst enemy,
Another factor we have to talk about, Todd. Ari Emanuel, since his antitrust settlement, has been really flexing his financial and political muscle. This guy flex his muscle to try to get Joe Biden out of the president's race in 2024. So if you're Judge Boulware, you're looking at it this way, saying, wait a second, the owner of this company happens to be the king of Hollywood, and now he's trying to basically run presidential politics. What has he demonstrated since the proposed settlement that says any sort of behavioral changes happen? It's not.
Yeah, and for me, it's like we've always felt that Dana White, in some ways the UFC might be better off without him in some ways, or at least I have. You would think they would tell him, look, if we're going to still kind of act in this, maybe not be so loud about it.
Well, at this point, I think the product inside the cage is not the primary focus that motivates these guys every day when they get up. Ari Emanuel is political 100% of the time. Dana White is trying to be more of a cultural icon and trying to create kind of this legacy post-UFC. Hunter Campbell, you know, he wants to be the next guy incoming, and so they've obviously featured him heavily on Roku. You know, and all these guys, they're so embedded into government lifestyle, they can't get their head out of the bubble. And so they're stuck in it. And so they get high on their own supply, and we saw what happened. They all believed that they're untouchable. They still believe they're untouchable, and they will continue to believe that they're untouchable unless they lose the trial.
Right. And that's why I think could end up coming back to bite them, because, you know, when UFC first acquired, you know, I mean, when Zuffa first acquired the UFC, they didn't have as much infrastructure, you know, and that's why all these emails have come out and leaked, you know, of them just talking blatantly about screwing people over and, you know, owning MMA and all these things like that, which they probably wouldn't do now if they had it to go back and do, you know. So there's a lot of stuff from those early years that I'm sure they did all kinds of stupid stuff. There's probably stuff we haven't seen.
Absolutely. But again, the MMA business was very lively and fruitful and a cultural phenomenon, and it was engaging for everyone to get involved in. They took out the competition, and now it's as banal and political and about lobbying and nothing about the fighting.
Yeah, I think the product is way worse than it was.
Because the product in Ari's mind, he's not selling a product. He's selling access. He's selling government contracts. To him, he's selling celebrity. That's why Dana White and Donald Trump are his two biggest celebrities. So that's what he knows how to sell. That's why there's so much of a focus there with them and Rogan. Those are celebrities. Those are things he can sell, and those are distractions and shiny toys sometimes for him. That's what he knows. But as far as selling fights, yes, they sell enough content to keep the gravy train going. But as we're seeing, they're starting to have some declining returns on their matchmaking and their talent recruitment. They're no longer recruiting blue chip athletes. I mean, we have the Olympics right now in Paris. Have you heard one athlete at all say, wow, I want to fight in UFC? No, that dream is over.
Yeah. It is interesting how that became. You know, I'm going to talk to Jeremy Horn probably here soon. And I notice, like, after every UFC event, he always says the level of grappling in MMA now is pathetic. You know, and I think people today, they think MMA has evolved, but in some ways I feel like it's devolved. You know, it's gone backwards.
It's completely devolved. Completely.
Yeah. And you're right, that dream that, you know, they used to recruit at the NCAAs and things like that, it doesn't seem like as many guys are interested, like you said.
Well, why would you? Because there's nothing interesting creatively. There's nothing interesting financially. There's nothing interesting that helps you build a campaign and a brand or anything else, because UFC doesn't want to build you as too strong of a brand because they want complete control.
Yeah, I'm astonished, like you had said before. I kind of keep coming back to this, how they've continued to act like this when the case is not done, you know? Even before the settlement got announced, they were still behaving crazily. You know, when they were still doing a lot of the same things. They took the sunset clause out of their contracts, for example, which anybody would say, well, dang, they're just doubling down on what they're doing.
Yeah, they have no remorse. They haven't even tried to fake it.
Yeah, they're just kind of doing it in plain sight.
So, I mean, if you ask me, what are the prospects of this going to trial? I'd say 70% right now and 30% a change of heart by UFC to split the settlements. But are they willing to go up from 335 million to, let's say, 575? I highly doubt it.
You don't think they would?
No.
Because part of me was thinking on the way home, I knew I was going to talk to you. I was thinking maybe I already know what you think about this based off of what you've been saying, but like if I was in Ari Emanuel's shoes, maybe I'd think, okay, there's other pro sports that operate and their athletes have, collective bargaining, free agency, all these other things, and they're successful. Maybe we could be successful even though we're not as restrictive. But you don't think he's
They're so invested and so wedded politically and culturally and business-wise to this model that they have to meet a certain percentage for value extraction that if the business doesn't provide it, they want out of the business.
That's interesting. Never. If they got out of it, that might just cripple the UFC, right?
Well, that's the biggest impact to me of the whole Judge Boulware case. Let's say they do go to trial and they do lose to Kong Lee. Well, if they're going to lose to Kong Lee, they're more than likely going to lose to Cajun Johnson. So they have to fight with all their might on this situation when this goes to trial, because if this wins for the plaintiffs are surely going to win the other battle. That's a bad, bad sign for them. And again, that's the entire business for them. It's the contracts. It's the restrictive nature of talent engagement. If they don't have that, why would they be in the business? And also, any sort of implication, let's say an adverse judgment in an antitrust trial, you don't think Ari Emanuel won't be worried about what that means for WWE? You don't think he won't be worried about what that means for his Hollywood clients and how they currently engage with arbitration clauses and all sorts of class action waivers? Of course they'd be petrified by it. But yet they were so overconfident, and clearly their lead counsel, Bill Isaacson, was so confident about a settlement. They just never, I think, in my opinion, in my estimation, they never considered what Plan B was going to be.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing. So maybe if I let you look in the future, what you think is the next shoe to drop, so to speak. I know the judge is going to have his statement. People will look at that. But what do you think is the next kind of the big thing to come?
I think the next big story or part of the story is whether or not Eric Kramer, the lead attorney, survives. Does he stay on as the lead attorney for this case? Does he take a back step and does someone else step up? Does he remove himself from the case because of the way Judge Boulware has been treating him? Does he actually decide, hey, I'm going to change course here and I'm going to be very aggressive and we're going to fight UFC tooth and nail at trial? Does he believe that he is the guy who can actually be the trial attorney and win it? Does he believe and have enough confidence in himself and enough information and command of the facts to win over a jury? This is going to be very, very difficult. And, it's not a job that many people can do. And so you're always going to be second guessing yourself. And I think the knives are going to be out now. I think we're going to see Judge Boulware kind of entice, kind of nibble, kind of tease for solicitation of fighters or attorneys who are not involved in the case to say, hey, you might want to step up here and you want to raise a challenge about counsel right now. You'll have a voice in my courtroom. So I think Eric Kramer, as lead attorney, has a lot of fights on his hand, and I think it's coming from all different directions. We'll see if he can survive it and if he can thrive.
I want to ask you a couple things actually that just came to my head. And this is going to be stuff I see on Twitter. For example, I feel like the judge, people say, well, he's not a juror, but he has some liability when he's looking at these settlements, especially if the evidence points to them being in violation. If he approves some sort of BS settlement, that's on him. And I don't think people realize that.
I think it's a big part of his decision making because he's taken this very seriously and saying, wait a second, I approved the settlement, nothing changes. People are going to look back at me a decade or 2 decades or, a generation later. They're going to say, wait a second, what was this guy doing? Why was this guy a rubber stamp? Why did he allow this to continue when he saw the evidence that nothing was going to change? So absolutely, I think there's certainly a factor of hero ball, like Kobe Bryant style hero ball in his calculation. I think he sees himself as the last man standing between a permanent monopoly and where we are now.
And the other thing I saw Fight Oracle mention is maybe the UFC could move their whole operation like to the Middle East. What do you think about that?
I've always been very curious about when they were going to sell the UFC to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I've always been very curious about that for at least a year and a half, because you have to take that into calculation. The Ali Act's not going to apply there,
Mm-hmm.
and but the bigger question is, do they want to run the Middle East? Do they want to run a more European-centric product because of the antitrust laws with the European Union? There's a lot of roadblocks to selling the UFC to the kingdom and expecting business to stay the same. And I don't think they war gamed it out that far. I think they certainly considered it and maybe dreamed about it. But I do not believe the Team UFC has actually put a plan on paper and said, hey, this is what would happen and what we would want and how we would run things if it was to the kingdom.
Now that the judge has shown that he's not just going to rubber stamp a settlement, do you think maybe the UFC's behavior will change in the near future? Just at least publicly?
No. If anything, I predict, and I'm going to say this for the first time publicly, Todd, I predict we're going to see a scorched earth campaign that like you've never seen. I think we're going to see a combination of writers claiming that Judge Boulware is violating the civil rights of fighters by not approving the settlement. I think we're going to see a combination of kind of a Trump-Hillary campaign against Judge Boulware. We're going to see a lot of negative press. We may see some private investigators go after this guy. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be Team UFC leading the charge or even, investigating Judge Boulware, but there may be some people in around this case or even hanger-ons or fanboys who are going to say, hey, I want to get my 15 minutes of fame. Let's get involved in this case and let's bring the circus around, and we might engage in some negative campaigns against Judge Boulware. So buckle up. I think we're going to see some nasty vitriolic comments about him and his jurisprudence, and this is going to get very ugly very quickly.
Do you think Ari Emanuel anticipated this when he bought the UFC?
No. Yes, they had the case. Yes, the case was filed before he bought UFC, and certainly he had an awareness of it. But I don't think he ever envisioned a scenario that's going to trial.
Yeah, that's one thing I think about. Is like, you have board of directors now, a new owner. Do they look at like someone like Dana White and say, is this guy more trouble than he's worth at this point?
But is it all about Dana, or is it about the actual system?
Right, but they were the ones that were in violation all this time, and they gleefully did it. Like you said, they've been gleefully doing it for decades.
So in other words, in other words, Dana may get the rug pulled underneath him and sent packing to take the heat off their faults, but it's not going to cover up the fact that it's more of a system-wide issue than just Dana.
Right, but they created the system.
Of course they did.
Yeah. Those restrictive contracts and everything, that was the UFC's doing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The other thing I want to ask you about is like, do you think some of these managers or businesses, some of these clothing line sponsors that they put out of business, promoters, do they have an argument in all this?
That has always been the million-dollar question. I believe that if Congolese wins at trial, I think we're going to see Pandora's box open for future antitrust lawsuits against UFC.
Yeah, because, guys like Monty Cox that they basically ran out of the UFC, and they brought in their own little management, which I think could blow up in their face too, because that's another thing, like you're saying, the action of still acting this way blatantly.
No one wants to piss off the giant until someone wins. Once someone wins, the floodgates open like U.S. politics.
Right. Because I feel like someone like Monty really has nothing to lose. They ran him out. He's still running his own events. He manages some fighters, but he won't be able to manage them in the UFC. And, it's someone like him could probably have an argument because they actively engaged in trying to get fighters cut away from him.
And this is another risk of why UFC should not want to go to trial, even if the evidence is currently fixed. Do you really want to have a discussion publicly about whether or not managers are employees under your umbrella, or what exactly are they? What are the contractual ties? What are the relationships? Do you want that information out there? Do you want to have a microscope on that? I mean, that alone, I think, should cause some concern for them.
But you still think that that's the direction they're going to go?
Yes. They're so confident that they'll win at trial. I believe that entirely.
So they'll just pull their settlement at this point?
Unless they're willing to dramatically increase the cash, I do not see a settlement on the horizon.
I don't think any amount of money will work unless they make changes to their behavior.
That's the Boulware issue. Yes, I think in their minds, maybe they could increase the money and then try to kill off Johnson in the courts outside of Boulware. But again, that's not a guarantee.
Yeah. It's fascinating stuff. I mean, I could think of, things in my head that I want to ask you, but, I think this is kind of like a good start as far as what are you looking at next to write about, or do you want to give your readers any kind of maybe foreshadowing of stuff you're going to cover?
Our focus at the MMA Draw right now is going to be about what do the fighters think, how do they react, who's going to try to get involved in this case now that the settlement's killed, and what is the strategy moving forward for both sides? Can the plaintiffs keep a united front? Or are we going to see kind of political style infighting? And on the other side, what is TK going to tell the hedge funds? What are they going to tell the bag holders? What are they going to tell the investors? Yes, we're making all this money, and yeah, we'll kill this trial and we'll likely win. But at some point, there's going to be a crisis of confidence, whether it's legally or managerially, and people are going to start pointing the fingers. And do we point the fingers at Ari? Do we point them at Mark Shapiro? Do we point them at Hunter Campbell? Who do we point them at besides Dana White?
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. Maybe you could talk a little bit about, before I let you go, is about your background before you got in the MMA Draw, so maybe some newer fans could really understand the stuff you were covering in MMA for decades, really.
Sure. I was covering mixed martial arts both in Japan and in the States in the late 90s. I did some translating. I did some live play-by-play. And then during the period with Pride, when they were the big promotion, the big monster, and certainly UFC was scared of them. Let's not forget about that. It's so interesting, by the way, how in this whole antitrust case, the ghost of Pride still lingers. And we saw that with a massive crowd for Ryzen over the weekend. And yet in America, it's as if everyone pretends it doesn't exist. There actually was someone that was bigger and better than UFC. And of course, UFC rewrote history, and that's been pretty unkind. So I covered both Pride and UFC. I covered the rise of UFC from the day one, the downs, and then what the Fertittas did to get it back up, and what kind of hole they were really in, and how they've been rewriting history about how they invented rules and brought weight classes and all this garbage. So, I respect them and their business acumen, but I also have been around forever to call out, BS on these people who have come in and out of the business. And I fully have an understanding both legally, financially, and culturally in different markets and countries about the history of the sport. And that's why I have such a great time talking with you and Miguel. And I hope to cover more of this at the MMAdraw.com. And I just want people, especially newer fans who have been brought in and don't understand what the history of mixed martial arts is, I want them to appreciate and understand that just because we were there doesn't mean that we're old or that we're out of touch or that we're the old man screaming on the front lawn. No, we understand and have nuance and complexity about what is going on and why we see a lot of warning signs and how, for some of us who were around when it was beginning, why we're alarmed at what we're seeing. And I hope that we bring readers into our orbit and that they have a comforting feeling that, hey, we're not misleading them, we're telling them the truth, and that we want to respect them as fans, and we want everyone in the business to be respected and to understand what the purpose of it was before it became this monolithic monopsony.
I do want to get your thoughts. You just mentioned Super Rising. So kind of give me your thoughts on that whole thing. They had a massive crowd. I think it was 40,000 something. And
48,000
you brought it up
show without Kai Asakura.
Yeah. Just give me your thoughts on that.
I think it's a vindication that Japan is still a crown jewel market, that the UFC's McDonald'sfication of we got to have soul shows or else we're not coming and we're not going to do our business. I think Japan, and I think what we're seeing in Poland and elsewhere with these promotions like Octagon, what we're seeing is mixed martial arts is more than just UFC, but you've been brainwashed that UFC is the entire business and the end-all be-all, and that there are just some markets and some fans that UFC is not going to be able to buy off or brainwash, and they may be able to rewrite the history in America, but they're not going to be able to do it globally. And I think there is a groundswell of disappointment and disgust with what UFC has become right now. And I would say, dare I say, boredom. I think UFC right now is a very boring product. They don't respect their fans. They're just about process and cash at this point. Yes, they have a strong brand, and they're always going to have a strong brand, but would you eat McDonald's every night for dinner? No, you get sick of it very quickly. Well, that's what MMA fans have been conditioned to believe. If you don't eat UFC every day, well, then you're not really having dinner. Well, I think that's changing, and I think the Ryzen show was a demonstration that people are looking for something different, something that culturally appeals to them and has relevance. And that's the danger for UFC. They better not lose their relevance or they're going to lose their grip on the market.
So you think that for the first time, maybe that the ghost of pride is starting to kind of rise again?
Absolutely. I mean, they had 15 years. UFC had 15 years to get their shit together in Japan. And they failed to do it because they didn't want to change their product, their matchmaking, their culture. They didn't want to do it. They didn't want to do any of it. And they blew it. And now they're going to leave the market open. And it's a very successful market, a historic market, and a great market to export your product.
What do you think about the Garcia and Manny Pacquiao news that they're going to have an exhibition on New Year's or whatever?
What a nightmare. This is where Nobu gets in his way, but I understand why he's doing it, but it doesn't have appeal domestically. That's not why people showed up. That's not why 48,000 people showed up to Saitama Super Arena. So hopefully he gets out of his own way on that front. But other than that, I think the fans are saying we want action. We are a new generation of fans, and we're not UFC fans. And that's the most important thing.
Yeah, you think they just kind of showed up because, they want to get behind a new kind of product?
Yes, they want to make a stand. They want to be relevant again. And I think that's absolutely something to be respected.
Yeah, it is kind of for a while there, it seemed like all the Japanese fighters were getting filtered to the UFC by Shu Harada.
Well, I think the word has gotten out, especially with Kyoji Horiguchi, that you fight cheap doesn't have so much appeal to the Japanese.
Right. Yeah, because he ended up.
And the other factor I would say that goes against UFC, especially in Japan, just because you become big in in the UFC doesn't mean you're big in Japan. For a while, people assumed, oh, well, UFC is the only place you can become a global superstar. We have to go over there. Well, the fighters figured out, well, yeah, we had some success in UFC, but they don't really respect us or really respect the Japanese marketplace. And so they're not going to do anything to help us become bigger back home. So why fight there?
Why do you think Asakura is going there?
I think he hit a wall at certain points, and I'm certainly the management and maybe his family and friends kind of made the calculation that it was best to at least get a run in America and then come back home as a conquering hero. We'll see if that gamble pays off or not.
What do you think about the Bare Knuckle FC and Ryzen? I want to get your comments on that because they're doing some bare knuckle.
I like
now.
the combination. I think it's a perfect combination. It's just like going to the ice cream shop and getting a different flavor. I think it adds a little bit of I don't want to say a circus, but it definitely adds a little bit of an edge to a product that could certainly use the publicity, and I think it works fine. And it may open the door for Conor McGregor to make an appearance since Nobu likes his celebrity appearances. I would not be shocked by that.
Do you think they could ever get tension in there for a boxing match, or
I think at this point they don't have enough money, but if they continue to run a few big shows, they could.
Yeah, maybe Inoue or Tension, get one of those guys in there for a boxing match since they're willing to do different things.
I think Tension would be the one, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. I could talk to you about this stuff all day long. I appreciate you taking the time. I know you're busy with the writing and all. And just tell people where they can find your stuff again.
TheMMADraw.com. Subscribe to our email list. It's a great subscription. I would highly encourage it. My old school archives, FightOpinion.com. And I'm on Twitter at FightOpinion. So you can get a hold of me anytime, any place, anywhere, and I will respond to you as soon as possible.
Yeah, and it's all great stuff. I encourage people to read and read his Twitter especially. Zach, again, I always appreciate the time. People really loved your last appearance. And I hope to do more of them in the future.
Absolutely. It's great to talk with you, Todd.
Yeah. I appreciate the time. And as always, people who support this, check out Zach Arnold. And until next time, till next episode, take care.
I'm going to give you a shout out, Todd, because a lot of people might not know how long you've been in the game for. I mean, Todd, you've been in the game since day one, and not a lot of people might not know it. It's to me, when I see all these guys in the game, I always, I just go, man, you don't know what the game is about because you ain't even been in it. When I see guys like you still involved, and these new jacks come in, they may not give you your respect, and they need to give you your respect because you've been in the game just as long as anybody. You know what I'm saying? So, if y'all out there, y'all gotta recognize Todd been in the game since day one.